Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice, is back in the news today after ProPublica has done a scathing takedown of more gifts from more billionaires that he has been receiving that nobody knew about. We've already heard about the private school tuition for his nephew from Harlan Crow, as well as Harlan Crow, the billionaire, buying his mother's house for him, and all of those disclosures that came out. But what ProPublica has done is they have gone back to 1991 and they've identified 3 more billionaires who are just showering him with lavish gifts. Before we go into that in detail, though, let's talk a little bit about what the rules are. Some people say that Supreme Court justices aren't required to disclose anything, that there's no code of ethics, that there's no law governing them. They're right and they're wrong. So they are a lifetime appointment, right? A lifetime presidential appointment that is confirmed by the Senate. So lifetime means lifetime. And so there really isn't a body that polices them. And when the Senate Judiciary Committee recently invited them to come in, invited Chief Justice Roberts to come in to testify, he declined, saying separation of powers. So there really isn't anyone to police them. I believe they can be impeached if they do something wrong, but what standards are they held to? Now, there are certain laws that do apply to them, even if they don't have an official code of ethics, okay? They also don't have term limits because it's a lifetime appointment. But they do have to file financial disclosure reports, right? This comes from the Ethics and Judicial Conduct Policy, as well as from the Ethics in Government Act of 1978. There's also the Ethics Reform Act of 1989, and this is in 5 United States Code sections 101 through 111. And it applies to all 3 branches, actually, all federal employees, whether you work for the White House, whether you work for the court, or whether you work for Congress, both the elected or appointed officials as well as their staff. And in May of 2022, very recently, Joe Biden signed the Courthouse Ethics and Transparency Act, which basically said all of the stuff that you guys have to, that the Supreme Court has to disclose, that now has to be in a searchable database online. It wasn't before. They filled it out, but it was like not accessible to the public. So this just basically closed a loophole so that there was no more secrecy, okay? It also closed a loophole that allowed companies and individuals to secretly shower justices with lavish gifts like 5-star travel because they could just call it personal hospitality. Now it all has to come out. So all of those laws have basically made it so you have to disclose all that stuff, right? And it's searchable for the public. This March in 2023, Congress passed in even another revision that requires judges to be even more specific. So everything from income, investments, honorarium, your dependent children, your spouses, so Ginny Thomas, other income, pensions, royalties, property, reimbursements, dividends, the list goes on and on and on and on, right? And what are these things that have to be disclosed? And it's pretty specific when you look at the definition of what has to be disclosed in these statutes. And let's just read it together, right? A payment in advance, a forbearance, rendering, deposit of money, or anything of value, unless consideration of equal or greater value is received by the donor, including food, beverages consumed in connection with a gift of overnight lodging. Note, a gift does not include, inheritance, mementos, right, of a function honoring or reporting an individual. So like if he gets an award, right, that doesn't have to be, like a little trophy or something. That doesn't have to be disclosed. Food, lodging, transportation, and entertainment provided by a foreign government within a foreign country or by the United States government, the District of Columbia, or a state or local government. Food and beverages that are consumed without a gift of overnight lodging. Communications to the offices reporting of individual, including subscriptions to newspapers, periodicals, Exclusions and exceptions and hospitality extended for non-business purposes by an individual, not a corporation or organization, at the personal residence of that individual or his or her family, or on the property or facilities owned by that individual or his family, right? So the personal hospitality gift reporting exemption applies only to food, lodging, or entertainment and is intended to cover such gifts of a personal, non-business nature. So it does not include, this exemption does not include gifts other than food, lodging, or entertainment, such as transportation that substitutes for commercial transportation, like a private jet. Doesn't say that, I just added that. Gifts extended for a business purpose. Gifts extended at property or facilities owned by an entity rather than an individual. And it goes on and on. Gifts paid for it by any individual or entity other than the individual providing the hospitality, right? So it goes on and on. I'm not going to read it in detail, but you get the gist. And these rules are for judges, including Supreme Court judges. And why do we have these rules? Now, early on, I've been a public servant for 30 years. And early on, I was taught that you just don't receive gifts. It looks bad, right? And we had certain disclosure requirements, like if anyone gave you anything of value, like that was above, I think it was $25 or $10, it was some amount that you were not allowed to accept, right? And other than like birthday gifts from your family and those sorts of things. But you really shouldn't receive any gifts. You're a public servant and it just looks bad. And so I had the reason I don't know the exact amount is because I had a blanket rule that I wouldn't accept anything, period, full stop. So I'd go out to lunch with friends. I'd go out to lunch with defense attorneys who were my friends when I was a prosecutor. And some of them were private defense attorneys and made a lot of money. And they'd be like, oh, this one's on me. And I'd say, nope, I always pay for myself 100% of the time because I don't want to ever be accused of, an appearance of impropriety. And I wasn't unique in this. Everyone I know and worked for was like that. Judges who I was friends with would never let me buy them dinner or lunch or even a cup of coffee from the cart below, because they never want to be put in a position where where anyone could accuse them of doing something because of, any little tiny thing that was given to them. And that's what everyone that I know who works for the government, the way they conducted themselves. I've never seen it any other way because that's just what people do. And so it's shocking to me that Clarence Thomas or anyone in the Supreme Court, anyone in that magnitude, would do the things that they are accused of doing. He said his excuse was, early on in his tenure at the court, he was advised that hospitality with close friends that didn't have business before the court was not reportable. And as I said earlier, a couple months ago, the United States Senate invited Roberts to speak to the Senate to talk about these laws and what their standards are. And, he wrote a letter back that basically was, look, we consult with all sorts of different sources, even if we're not bound by them. It was like a blow off almost. And, he's like, we look at scholarly articles and teachers or treatises, and we talk to smart people. And, and Thomas always, he always would like talk in public and say that he doesn't, like a lavish life. He prefers, RV parks to, fancy vacations. And he even has an RV and, that he's a simple guy and he's humble and all that. And that was sort of his little shtick, right? And he said this over and over again. But meanwhile, what we learned from ProPublica was that he was being flown around in private jets and taken to fancy vacations. But none of this was reported and none of this was known to anyone, right? And so what ProPublica basically showed us was that since 1991, at least 4 ultra-wealthy benefactors, including Harlan Crow, were buying him everything from a 9-day vacation to Indonesia. That was from Harlan Crow. Harlan Crow also paid for his nephew's private school and his mother's home. And, his whole thing with the RV parks, and he's just a regular guy. Well, guess what? That was privately funded by a guy named Anthony Welters, who's an executive in the healthcare industry. He says it was a loan and that they're close friends, but no one ever disclosed that. We don't know if it was paid paid back. We don't know any of that, right? It also talked about 3 other donors, David Sokol, Wayne Huizenga, and Tony Novelli, all apparently billionaires in their own right. And Clarence Thomas claims that they're friends. Well, their friendship started after he was on the court. So I wonder, how close are they and why are they friends, right? I don't have billionaires in my life who are paying for my kids' private school or taking me on lavish vacations. But, maybe he's that interesting and fascinating and nice of a guy. But in any event, they found at least 38 destination vacations, including a huge mega yacht, 28 private jet flights, 8 private helicopter rides, or trips, I should say, 12 VIP passes to sporting events, 2 luxury resorts, and 1 standing invitation to some uber exclusive golf club, right? The dollar amounts that this is worth is in the millions. And this was never publicly disclosed, right? Even if these people didn't have in any cases before the court, because that is one thing the judges are supposed to do, is recuse themselves if anyone individual has any business before the court. They also, if you recall what I read earlier, justices have to disclose any investments they have in anything. Because say he has Apple stock. Well, if Apple appears as a case before the court, he has to disclose that and recuse himself from that. That's what that means. But even if these 4 or 5 individuals didn't have anything before the court, they definitely are in industries that have an interest before the court, right? Like the healthcare guy, he might have not had anything directly before the court, but Supreme Court has ruled on healthcare, things like Obamacare and other healthcare issues that clearly could impact someone in the healthcare industry. But he doesn't recuse himself from that. This recusal, again, is something that is a little murky because of these issues that might affect the businesses of his billionaire friends. Look, this guy, Clarence Thomas, has always had a bad ideology anyway, so I'm not necessarily sure that any of these individuals have influenced him worse than before, but it still is a really bad look, if nothing else. Now, what is the standard for bringing any action if someone wanted to under the statutes that these ethical statutes? It has to be that it was willfully falsified or he willfully failed to disclose standard. He can hide behind well, I got advice from people, and they're all sort of rallying the troops around each other about how, we know what to do and we can police ourselves. But it doesn't really seem like it, right? It doesn't seem like it if Justice Roberts isn't even willing to testify before the Senate and talk about these rules and what they do. Some people are saying that Thomas should be impeached for this. And, that is something that the Senate could look at, or the House would look at, actually, potentially impeaching him, whether or not this violates disclosure laws. And at the very least, they could call the billionaires to testify before the Judiciary Committee to talk about what did you give them and what were the circumstances and what did you talk about, et cetera, et cetera. At the very least, this has clearly violated the public trust, and there's a serious legitimacy crisis that the Supreme Court has now, partly because of the fact that there is no transparency. They don't police themselves because they have been empowered. These right-wing judicial activists have been empowered by people like President Trump, who has appointed other right-wing judicial activists to the court. And Chief Justice Roberts was somebody I always respected, even though I didn't agree with a lot of his opinions, because he is on the right traditionally. And he's not known to be a right-wing activist the way others are, like Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Thomas. justice. But, Justice Roberts, I'm losing faith in him as well, because he needs to rein this in. He needs to bring back the legitimacy of the Supreme Court that used to be a respected, storied institution. Even if you didn't agree with what they did, you at least respected them. You at least thought they believed in the rule of law. At least they believed in things like stare decisis and precedent and doing the right thing and interpreting the law and calling balls and strikes as they saw them. But as we've seen recently, this activist Supreme Court is really no longer has legitimacy. The overturning Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs decision, I think, is the clearest example about how they really don't care about precedent. People who testified before Congress or before the Senate Judiciary Committee for their confirmation, the justices lied. They said whatever they needed to say to get on the court, and they're going to rule the way they want to rule, whether or not it has anything to do with the law. And things like what's happening with Justice Thomas is really doing more to erode the public trust in the Supreme Court. Look, he's married to Ginny Thomas, who has serious problems and was texting with Mark Meadows, right? I mean, like the Thomases are people who are doing more damage to the court than I think any other justice for all of these reasons and all of the illegitimate relationships and money that they receive. The appearance here is crystal clear of how unreasonable this is and the conflict of interest that this poses on issues before the court. How can he not be compromised getting these level of gifts? I mean, personal hospitality, give me a break. That's being invited to someone's house for dinner. That's bringing someone a pie because, they lost their mother. But these sorts of things, getting flown around on private jets and millions of dollars worth of decisions, how can that not influence his decisions? I think the Senate, again, needs to hold hearings and call people to testify because this is outrageous, even if the justices refuse to come. And by the way, the separation of powers argument is a little bit BS too. After all, the court is funded by Congress. They're appointed by Congress. I mean, there is some oversight, there are checks and balances too. It's not just separation of powers in three separate silos. There are checks and balances. And so people need to step up and start doing their job there as well, because I, as a lawyer, am losing faith in the court. I'm Karen Friedman Agnifilo from Legal AF. Join us every Wednesday and Saturday. Thank you for listening.
Hey, Meidas Mighty. Love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.